I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside. It's so comfortable and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show on the Choose Yourself Network. Today on the James Altucher Show.
You got to do the thing that only you can do. And so I think the Stoic focus is totally on this. As soon as you hand over your definition of success to an outcome that's beyond you, that's misery. The recognition that most people are chasing in their field is fundamentally not up to them. And then this is why they wake up and they're frustrated or they're upset or they feel discriminated against or screwed over, because they've handed the definition of success over to someone else, and it turns out that other person doesn't give a shit about you.
Right, so I agree. When you kind of like outsource success to some committee's determination, that's a problem. But let's say you're in the middle of it. You're in the middle of the war. And, you know, the outcome's very important to you, it seems, when you're in the trenches in the war. And yes, you can do the best you can do today. That's all you can really do. But it's hard to kind of, it's sort of like this muscle of stoicism you have to practice in advance of that moment.
Of course.
Quite a bit. Thanks everyone for coming, and we're gonna talk. We're gonna have a podcast, and then we're gonna have some Q&A, and Ryan's gonna give out challenge coins to everybody who asks a question. So think of your questions along the way, and we're here to talk about his book. Oh, I'll hold the real book.
James has like the earliest possible copy. This is like before it was even edited.
I didn't think you were such a bad speller until I read this early copy, but now I figure you clean up your act pretty well.
Yeah.
So I just want to tell one quick story.
Okay.
So when we first met, or around the time we first met, I gave Ryan what I thought was excellent advice, which is, you know, he had just come out with the book Trust Me, I'm Lying, which is your excellent book on marketing. And I said, you should start like a marketing agency, like this boutique agency, build it up to a few million in revenues, and then sell it to an advertising conglomerate for 10 million. And then you could do whatever you want after that. And I think you did it for about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And then the next thing I knew, you had moved back to Austin. You basically had skipped my entire advice and just started doing what you wanted to do instead of working to do what you wanted to do, which I thought was really smart, because I spent 15 years trying to do what I wanted to do until I realized I could just do it.
Yeah, I feel like life's too short to go do something you really don't want to do for an extended period of time, so that one day, if you're lucky, you can have the opportunity to do the thing that you want to do. I was talking to this guy, he's a mutual friend, but I won't put him on blast, but he was leaving being an author. He was going to start like a VC fund. And it's not the person you think that I'm going to say. But I was like, okay, so if this is really successful, if you raise all this money, you invest in these companies, you sell those companies. Let's say you walk away with like $20 million. I was like, what are you going to do with $20 million? And basically, he walked me through this convoluted plan that ended with him becoming an author again. And I was like, you can do that right now. It's what you're already doing. And so I think people don't really think about where they want to end up. They just think they need to do all these things to one day have the freedom to do that, when really you pretty much have the freedom to do it right now.
And I think this is related, but not necessarily related to your book, but I'll just mention, I think people have a hard time figuring out what is they think there's this imaginary number that they need to hit in order to suddenly trigger, like, okay, now my life is flipped and now I can do whatever I want.
Yeah.
And essentially most people like the lifestyle they live. Like, let's say you live in any place in the US and you make $100,000 a year, so you're living on $70,000 a year. Your number is probably, if you like that lifestyle, your number is actually much smaller than you think it is. You just need to make $70,000 a year on interest, and maybe you work a little to up it somewhat. But it's probably very easy for most people to piece together the lifestyle they want without saving $20 million.
Yeah, of course. Or the thing that they think they need the $20 million to buy is actually much cheaper than they think it is. Like, you can go to the beach for $100. You don't need to. You can do these things more cheaply and more affordably than you think. But people put it off in the future, and then it never ends up happening.
Right. If you think about it, right now you could watch a $200 million movie right on a movie theater size screen in your apartment for a few $100s. You can get essentially what used to be called slaves and now are called, Grubhub delivery people. You can get any food cooked by a master chef could be delivered. It's as if that chef is in your kitchen. Could be delivered right to you sitting on the couch watching the $200 million movie. You need prescription drugs? Just call up the pharmacy. They'll send it right up. There's nothing.
But somehow people are actually more miserable now than ever before.
So people say that, and now we're going to start to segue into. Yeah. Is that actually true that people are more miserable now? Like, people say that, but is it true? And how do you define that?
I just mean people for all of history thought, if we just accomplish this, if we just get this, finally, like, we won't suffer, we won't be unhappy. But the truth is, the goalposts always move. There's this famous quote. Some sort of very well-known British sort of government official was talking to some American, and this is right as America is sort of ascendant, right around the turn of the 20th century, and he's like, why do you Americans think if you just have this empire, if you just conquer these things, you'll be happy? And he was like, look at us, we have the biggest empire in the world, and we are not happy, right? And I think we think that if we can just get on this other side of the mountain, it'll finally be good, and it never is. And this is true not only on the individual level, but I think this is true sort of, like, what does China think it's going to be like when they're the number one global superpower? I think they're going to find out that it sucks. It's probably better to be number two than it is to be number one.
Well, here's the other thing. What is the fear of being number two? Right. Like, there are many countries that are kind of numbers 2 through 20, and they don't seem to be.
Well, and actually,
different.
Most of those countries are able to be happier because they don't have the burdens of whatever being number one. Like, Sweden gets to do whatever they want because they know that the other powers are taking care of all the tough stuff. Like, the reason we don't have the reason that Europe has all these awesome sort of socialized medicine and all these awesome social programs is because, like, we pay to defend the world and they don't have to. We're getting political, but the point is, like, it's actually wonderful to be number two because you don't have the responsibilities and the burdens of everything falling on you.
Well, so now I will segue, because this is related to, so your book is Stillness Is the Key. It's the third in your, can you call it your Stoic trilogy?
I would call it a trilogy, but not a Stoic trilogy.
So you have Obstacle is the Way, Ego is the Enemy, now Stillness is the Key. This one I feel is the most, prescriptive. So Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy, I felt were books about looking at particular situations that were difficult and kind of reframing them to say, here's how you find the opportunity in these difficult situations. This one is more prescriptive in the sense you tell many stories about all these famous historical figures and how when they moved from let's say, overactivity, overthinking, even over philosophizing, and just kind of found their own particular stillness, and you list a lot of different methods to find this stillness, that actually kind of created well-being for them, and even success, whether it was monetary or political or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like when you look at like who the main figure is in like all of the religions or schools, so you look at Buddha, or you look at Marcus Aurelius, or you look at Socrates or Jesus, they're like the same guy. Like, I mean, it's unfortunate that it's all guys, but like the place that they got to, this sort of place of not being jerked around by their emotions, being very intentional, thinking very clearly, speaking very clearly, having a very clear sense of what's important and what's not important, having this sort of timeless wisdom. They're even though they're getting there in very different ways, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism or Stoicism or Hinduism, they get to the same place. Like there's no like philosophical school where the main figure is like running around busy and stressed out. Like the key, the end spot of all wisdom is some kind of stillness, some slowing down.
But let me ask about that, because it seems like in the modern world, like take Buddhism as an example, and people who strive for Buddhism, it's almost like the opposite of trying to find any kind of normal secular success. And
Sure.
yet, and the same with all of these religions, and many of the philosophies you mentioned. In Stillness Is the Key, you're talking about stories like ranging from John F. Kennedy to Mr. Rogers to Martin Luther King and many other people. These are people who did have secular ambitions. And so where does it come into play? Like, it's almost like Eastern philosophy and a lot of these religions that recommend almost like,
There's
emptying the
a
mind.
detachment. That I think is the fundamental problem with the Eastern philosophies, and why they don't totally resonate with people, and why I don't think they're quite the right fit for the world we live in. Because look, it's easy to find sort of stillness and peace when you are in an ashram in India, or you are on a 30-day silent meditation retreat in a beautiful monastery in the hills of Japan or something. But that's not real life. And why I tend to write about the Stoics, and why I think they're the sort of school most... We live in I was looking at some Twitter thread where they were like, the reason roads are a certain distance apart right now is because like that's the distance, like the width of a road is somehow descendant from like the width of roads of the Roman chariot. Like we live in a world, railroad tracks are a certain distance apart because this is a certain distance apart, ultimately because like that's the roads that the Romans built. So we live in a world that is like descended from ancient Rome. We don't live in a world in which I think Zen Buddhism or Confucianism, as important as they are in the East, it doesn't totally track, because there is this kind of detachment from the real world. Like, so if you think about Buddha's story versus, say, Marcus Aurelius, I'll get a little nerdy. Buddha, if he is a real person, I think he probably was, is a prince. His father is the king of some sort of small country. To seek enlightenment, Buddha has to renounce his the throne to which he is the heir, and he goes off into the wilderness, and he seeks enlightenment this way. So he achieves enlightenment by leaving the world behind. Marcus Aurelius is the opposite. He wants to be a philosopher, that's what he's doing, and then he's chosen to be emperor, and his greatness is that he fuses the two together. He becomes the emperor, and he's practicing philosophy while leading the largest empire that the world has really ever known. And so I love the idea. To me, that's the fundamental contrast between Stoicism and Buddhism, is that one is renouncing action in the real world, and the other is saying that actually, no, that's how you achieve enlightenment.
And so with Buddha, it's an interesting story, because obviously he's revered worldwide. The philosophy, millions or billions of people, both East and West, subscribe to it or subscribe to some aspect of it. But on the other hand, like you mentioned, he had to leave his wife behind, leave his child. He was basically a deadbeat dad. Like,
Yeah.
But then also he
That doesn't sound like enlightenment to me, by the way, that you walk out and your wife and kid to seek enlightenment. To me, that's a paradox. Like, it doesn't work, or it's a contradiction.
But then also he has to, as you mentioned, he's related to the royalty of one kingdom, but all these different kingdoms were at war with each other, and he's in the middle trying to just survive. So he had somewhat of a stressful life, just trying to navigate that. And
sure. But Buddha's not living in a house, right? Yeah. Like, Buddha doesn't have a job. Like, Buddha isn't doing any of the things that we have to do as people. So I think there's a lot of insight there, and clearly I tried to build a book around all sorts of insights from Eastern religion. Confucius is more interesting to me because Confucius was a political advisor. He sort of went from kingdom to kingdom. He was more like a Seneca figure, where he's integrally involved in the power politics of his time. And so, as much as he's talking about these things philosophically, he's also seeing that human beings are flawed, that human beings have ambitions, that people go to war with each other, that people kill each other. So I find Confucianism a little bit more sort of a bridge between, it's on the extremes. If you have Stoicism and Buddhism, some of these other schools are sort of right in the middle.
Well, you mentioned Taoism.
Yeah.
Just to finish the Eastern component, you mentioned Taoism quite a bit in the book as well, and there's a lot of argument. We don't know if Lao Tzu was a real person, and there's a lot of argument that maybe he was a political advisor just like Confucius, because the whole book can be reframed as political advice as opposed to spiritual advice. And so there it strikes me as much closer to the concepts you're talking about in Stillness.
I think so.
And so when we first spoke about Stoicism, I think it was 2014. It was right after, that's when Obstacle Is the Way came out, I think. So, and you mentioned to me something very interesting, which is that this is a philosophy that was equally attractive to Epictetus, who was a slave, and Marcus Aurelius, who was an emperor, or Seneca, who was a wealthy merchant.
Sure.
And I thought that was an interesting concept. Like, for you, what is Stoicism in today's day and age? I'm going to ask just the basic naive question.
Yeah, so to me, Stoicism is a philosophy for wherever you happen to be in life. Whether you're living an awesome life or, as was much more common in the Roman Empire, you somehow, the dice roll and you're in a shitty situation. Stoicism, to me, was this philosophy that was designed to help you get through that, or to live your best life. There's a lot less social mobility and agency in a society that has slaves. Like, thankfully, that's not where we are now. But people are still born into all sorts of circumstances that are not ideal, or they're born fat, or they're born short, or they're born this or that, and so they're struggling to figure out, like, how do I make the best of whatever I've been given? And to me, Stoicism is designed to help you sort of optimize from there. Like, so the 4 virtues of Stoicism are courage, which we know is important. Temperance, so moderation, we know is important. Justice, doing the right thing, we know is important. And then finally, wisdom, like intelligence, education, understanding. And so as a philosophy, those 4 virtues are true, whether you're true and imperative, whether you're the emperor or whether you're struggling at the ultimate, like, sort of lowest point of the food chain. And I think what Stoicism is there to do is to sort of give you a framework or a rubric for how to act, how to live, what standard to hold yourself to, sort of wherever you happen to be.
So, but sometimes, and this relates to everything you've written from Obstacles the Way to this book, Stillness Is the Key. Sometimes you can say that, like, okay, I'm going to live by my values, I'm going to live a life of integrity, blah, blah, blah. And then, as the great Stoic philosopher Mike Tyson has said, everyone has a plan until they're hit in the face.
Yeah.
So, like, somebody could be thinking, oh, I'm focused on the now, I'm living a Stoic life, and then their wife leaves them, they lose their job, they're angry, they're depressed, they don't know what's happened, they're afraid, they're really scared. And then if you're in that point of fear where you just don't know what is happening in your life and you don't know if things are ever going to be good again, what would be the first steps mentally you would take to bring yourself back to that stillness?
Well, I think that's what is so interesting about Stoicism is that Buddha, we don't really know any, like, sort of real things about him, right? Like, we know these sort of anecdotes and stories, but he's not, it's just long ago enough that it's hard to relate to that life. So, but I think Seneca is so fascinating. So Seneca is like this senator, he has a good job, he comes from the right family, he's powerful, And on totally trumped up charges, he's exiled from Rome. He's exiled to this like shitty island in the middle of nowhere. And he's miserable. And so he obviously wants to come back. This is not the life that he wanted for himself. He's this sort of well-known philosopher. And so finally they go, we know you want to come back. You're welcome back, but here's the catch. Like, you have to be the tutor to this kid who's going to be emperor. That sounds like a great job, except for that kid is Nero. And so Seneca becomes Nero's teacher. And it immediately becomes clear that, like, there's a reason that they offered this job to this person who was willing this, like, who they knew would have to say yes, because it's a really awful job, because Nero is like insane. Nero is Donald Trump, right? He's like deeply insecure, deeply egotistical, deeply in over his head.
Are you getting political?
Yeah. Obsessed with being liked, but being deeply unlikable at the same time, right? I could go on. And then you're sort of deeply corrupt and deranged in some way. Again, I could go on. But so now Seneca's like stuck in this predicament. Like, he wrote about how a philosopher only does what's good, and so he wrote about all these things in theory, and now his day job is to like show up and work for this guy who's like plotting to murder his own mother. And Seneca, I don't think, does a perfect job navigating this, as I don't think any human would be. And so for a long time, I think he's in this interesting situation where he's like, well, if I don't do the job, somebody else, maybe the job won't get done, right? Like, or if I don't do the job, someone worse will replace me. And this is like something a lot of people in the Trump administration have talked about, right? They're like, I felt like my job was like taking papers off Trump's desk so he didn't like pull us out of NATO, right? Like, people, so it's this complicated thing where like you're sort of complicit or active in something you disagree with, but the real world is complicated, and like, if you don't do it, it's going to happen anyway. And so it becomes this, he's sort of stuck in this really difficult position. Ultimately, he ends up deciding to leave, and Nero's like, it's not that simple, I'm not going to let you leave. And also Nero is like piling him with gifts. Like, Seneca becomes like the richest man in Rome by nature of this service. So it's like his ideals and his profession are in conflict with each other. Ultimately, I think, as sort of a cautionary tale, I mean, it ends in his death. Like, Nero has him killed. But to me, what I think, it's so easy to be glib, and it's so easy to think like, and I think this is where philosophy has failed, that it's so academic. It's like, of course you shouldn't do this, or, of course it should be like this. And the reality is the real world is complicated, and we struggle to make these decisions. And I think as a philosophy, and I think this is what we should be studying history to do, is like to help us navigate these tough situations. So you can imagine, though, Seneca taking this job is not a peaceful job, and he would have struggled quite dearly to wake up every day and deal with what must have been a horrible job. So I think Stoicism is there for precisely those kinds of situations. And that's, philosophy is designed not for the classroom, but for the very real and vexing moral dilemmas that people have in life.
Again, I think the common path people take is, and maybe this is a cliche to say this, but they go to college, they get the job, they get promoted, they get hired somewhere else for a higher salary, and then at the end of the day, they're retired, and that's it. They somehow succeeded in life. But what's the relationship between this stillness and Stoic philosophy and ambition? So Seneca clearly had some ambition, but
probably
where's
too
the
much.
line? Is it too much? Is it too little?
Well, so you've seen the movie Gladiator, right? Mm-hmm. There's a scene at the beginning of the movie where Commodus is like, his dad, Marcus Aurelius, clearly knows he has like a shitbird son, and it's not work. And Commodus goes like, Father, you told me what the virtues were, and he's justice, wisdom, temperance, courage, and he goes, and I don't have any of those virtues, and he goes, and Commodus in real life was like even worse than Joaquin Phoenix character plays, like, and is killed by a gladiator in real life. He goes, but I have other virtues. He's like, isn't ambition a virtue? Like, I have ambition. And the subtext is like, no, that's not a good virtue. But I think what they're talking about in the movie and what Marcus Aurelius talks about is like, it's good to want to be the best at what you do. It's maybe less good to want to be the number one at what you do. So does that distinction make sense? So like Marcus talks about like, so he goes like, sanity is tying your ambition to your own actions. Insanity and unhappiness is tying it to the recognition from others.
So maybe another way is he saying, okay, being number one, that's an outcome.
Yes.
That's an externally measured outcome.
Yeah.
Whereas being good today, what can I focus on today to be better? You're focusing more on the process than the outcomes.
Like hitting the New York Times bestseller list, that's an outcome outside of your control. Writing a really great book is something you control. Discovering something in science or making some breakthrough, that's in your control. Being recognized in the form of a Nobel Prize, that's up to the committee that decides who gets the Nobel Prize. Being an expert in constitutional law, that is in your control. Being admitted to the faculty at Harvard, not in your control. If you think about all the people who haven't been hired there over the years because they were Jewish or black or women, right? So there's the accomplishment of the thing that the part of the accomplishment that depends on other people, as you say, choosing you, and then there's the fundamental craft or ethics of the process. And so I think the Stoic focus is totally on this. And I like the Nassim Taleb thing where he goes like, making enough money to afford a BMW, that's up to you. Like making enough money to afford a private jet depends on hard work and luck. And so the Stoics are like, the luck part, since it's outside of your control, is not worth anything. The only part that matters is the part you control, which is the work and the craft and the process. So that's kind of how I think about it. So ambition, as long as the ambition remains the part of it that's up to you, is valuable. As soon as you hand over your definition of success to an outcome that's beyond you, that's misery. So like having a great podcast, great. Being number one is dependent on an algorithm, and I think you can break this down in any field. Like the recognition that most people are chasing in their field is fundamentally not up to them. And then this is why they wake up and they're frustrated or they're upset or they feel discriminated against or screwed over, because they've handed the definition of success over to someone else, and it turns out that other person doesn't give a shit about you.
Right. So I agree. When you kind of like outsource success to some committee's determination, that's a problem. But let's say you're in the middle of it. You're in the middle of the war, and the outcome's very important to you, it seems, when you're in the trenches in the war. And yes, you can do the best you can do today. That's all you can really do. But it's hard to kind of, it's sort of like this muscle of stoicism you have to practice in advance of that moment.
Of course, like with
quite a bit.
With this book. So it came out today, but I'm not perfect at it. I don't think it's possible the Stoic ideal is you're totally indifferent to externals. Maybe that's possible with a lifetime of work. I'm not sure. Like for me, it's like I'm proud to say I'm 80%. Like let's say that the success is there's 100 points. I would say I've taken 80% or 80 of the points off the table as success before it's out. That's from knowing that I put all the work I wanted to put into it. That I couldn't have done any better. That I said what I wanted to say, that I got the privilege of, like, all the part of, I got, let's say, 80 to 90% of the way there. And then now so let's say I'm blacklisted the day it comes out, or it very conspicuously does not get the spot that it earned on the list. Or, we thought sales were going to be X, and then surprisingly they were half X. All of that would affect me, but I'm not going to live and die by it, and it's not going to determine the majority of the happiness or opinion that I have of the thing. So it's like you start at zero, you're totally dependent on external validation. How can you work your way up so you're getting most of the way? I bet, like, obviously you care about how many downloads a podcast gets, right? But you've probably gotten to a point where what you're most happy with is like, did you have a really good show? Like, did you really get someone you wanted on? Did you feel like it was a good interview? And you care how many downloads it did up to a point, but it's not the majority of how you derive success from the experience.
For me, I sort of feel like you have to have a metric of determining what success is. So it could be this external metric, how many downloads did I get? That's one metric. For some people, it's how much money did you make?
Sure.
Because that's somewhat correlated supposedly to the value you created. That's supposed to be the correlation. Or it could be, oh, I felt really good about this podcast was great just because I simply felt good about it. And you sort of trust your inner compass enough to know, you have enough experience to know when something feels good that you say, yeah, this was good. This is how I want to feel about it. But let's say you're starting at zero, you're have a family, have responsibilities, the job is making you unhappy and you don't know what to do, and you're angry, maybe you're a little bitter. How do you start
wonderful.
practicing? And it's not an unusual case study. How do you start thinking in terms of, this book, Stillness Is the Key, is interesting. I'd like to start living my life like Mr. Rogers and many of the other people discussed in the book.
Yeah, I think you want to start. I think you want to start with like best practices. That's where when I really look at sort of elite performers in any field, they tend one principle is they don't actually seem to be that motivated by external results. You look at someone like Nick Saban, like the best college football coach in history. He seems more unhappy when they win than he is when they lose, because he has a much higher. He calls this sort of his inner scorecard. He's like, I am judging us against what we're capable of, not like what the score says. So we could be losing and I could be happy, and we could be crushing the other team and I could be unhappy. So that's just one principle that when you look at really successful people, they actually are not usually that motivated by external results. But I also look at like other practices that these people have, and I talk about it in the book. But I think generally this is a good. What are the people that you really admire that are sort of best in the world at what they do? What practices or habits do they tend to have? I tend to find they're very routine based, right? They're not waking up and like, what am I going to do today? It's like they know what they do every day, and that's just how it is. I think routine is really important. I think when you look at most great creatives, there tends to be some sort of walking practice. They seem to walk a lot. They go outside. They are not always doing. They take time to sit back and reflect. So I think walking would be a good one. You tend to find that they have some spiritual practice or purpose in their lives. Very rarely do the people you really admire turn out to be nihilists, right? Because why do it if you think it's all meaningless, right? I don't think that's a good one. So I talk about that in the book. I also think one of the most deeply personal ones that I talk about a lot now in my work is there's some active meditation on one's mortality. So like I wear a ring, it says memento mori, and on the inside it says you could leave life right now, let that determine what you do and say and think. And the idea being most of the people you really admire do not take even a minute for granted. They're not thinking like, oh, I'm going to live to be 80. They live as if they're on borrowed time. And this sense of borrowed time allows them to be productive. It allows them to prioritize what matters. It allows them to seize every moment. And I think it also allows them to be quite grateful for the time and privileges that they do have. So I think what you do is you look at the people you really admire, not just for the outcomes, but the people who seem to be handling their success well, who seem to have character that you admire, a life that you admire. And you try to back out from there. What are principles and practices that you can replicate in your own life? And I feel like what I try to do is I try to look at those things and then see where they overlap with the sort of Stoic practices, and then that's what my books are.
So you mentioned in all your books, and I love how this book interweaves various stories from political history, sports history. Again, even I'm just fascinated by the Mr. Rogers story. I never thought that would be my favorite childhood
I was
show.
much more excited that when I was writing the book, because I started writing the book in 2017, and this is like before the Good Neighbor book came out. This is before Tom Hanks was going to play Mr. Rogers in a movie. This is before the documentary. So I really felt like I discovered this like totally new side of this person, and it turned out like everyone was sort of onto it at the same time. But I do think he's a super fascinating. Like, I think if he was Catholic, he would be a saint. I think he would be like on the track to be a. Even just the idea that he was like a Presbyterian minister or Episcopalian, I forget. But like the idea that he was a deeply religious person and you could not tell 1 ounce of that from the show, but that he felt like the show was the best way to sort of witness and teach the principles that he believed in, I think is just like I think he's just an incredible human being.
I mean, do you feel that way? Do you feel like you writing these books is this way to get this message out that you so strongly believe in?
I mean, I can't think of another reason to write books. Like, I mean, if you're in books for the money, like you're in the wrong business, right? And if you're in books to be famous, you're also in the wrong business. Like, you should pick something else, right? And so I think ultimately you've got, the only reason to write a book is because you have something deeply urgent and important that you feel like needs to be said. And I think it's because it's something we were talking about earlier. I won't give away what you were talking about, but I feel like you got to do the thing that only you can do. And so I feel like I'm talking about, I think it's interesting, so I started writing about Stoicism when really no one was interested in writing about Stoicism. Like my publisher wasn't like, oh my God, we can't wait for a book about an obscure school of ancient philosophy. And now I think it's interesting, now that the books have worked, all these other people are writing about it as if it's like the hot thing. To me, that's a really crappy reason to write about anything, is that it's the hot thing. You should write about it because that's what you deeply believe as a person. So I wouldn't compare myself to Mr. Rogers, but I do feel like I'm writing about this because it's all I think about and all I want to talk about.
And who were your personal inspirations, but as you started writing this series, as you were writing this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I was really modeling it on any particular book, but I think Robert Greene, as a person who takes stories and uses them to teach lessons that he feels like people have lost, that was certainly a big model for me.
So, and I could see definitely Robert Greene's I feel like you have a softer touch. Like he'll dive really deep into someone's history and then pull the meaning like super deep, like into the weeds. Whereas you're kind of you're not assuming any knowledge from the reader. You'll kind of skirt through the main points of the story, find something that's interesting.
A lot of judgy language in how you're describing this.
No, I actually, but it's very similar to Robert Greene's style in some way, that you're taking these historical stories, you're finding what you value in those stories, and then bringing it to life.
Well, so
which he does in his own.
This book took like 2.5 years. Mm-hmm. Robert Greene's last book took, I think, 7 years. So I think Robert is going to like a DNA level, and he's going so in depth, and it's like each chapter is like hundreds of books that he's read. It's incredible. And so I think that's why he's the best in the world at what he does. I feel like what I'm doing is, I think his books are like the definitive take on X. And what I'm trying to do in my books is present kind of like an introduction to X. And so I'm trying to introduce people to a story or an idea or a thought, and then you can go read all the source material. So I just think we're in different lanes, but he is always like to me, like the bar that I'm comparing myself to.
And when you're writing these, I want to get into the writing process a little bit.
Yeah.
So it seems like you must read like 1,000 books for this. You take notes. I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
You probably take detailed notes on each one, and then find the things, like you said, that no one's maybe heard before, or nobody's heard with this particular twist on it.
Yeah.
And then that becomes a possible entry into the book.
Yeah, I think it starts with some idea, like some theory or argument that I want to make. So Obstacles started with this argument that, like, what if obstacles are actually opportunities? And that's sort of how the greats of history have thought about them. Or ego is this idea that ego is this kind of cancer that's eating away or undermining whatever it is that you're trying to do. And then this book is this idea that stillness is the sort of common theme between greatness of all types, and it's the common thread between all these different philosophies. So I had this argument, and once I have this sort of germ of an idea in my head, then as I'm reading and studying and researching, and also obviously referring to the research that I've already done, just generally, I start to notice sort of subheadings of that idea. So, what are examples of people doing that? And I try to find patterns, and then this book is like 32 chapters, right? Or something like that. And so what I'm doing is, here's my argument, and then here's sort of 30 sub-arguments that illustrate that argument, and I'm looking for stories that illustrate the principles that people are going to hopefully remember.
So do you ever feel like when you're looking at these stories, do you find that you, what's it called in statistics, when you fit too closely?
You're using what I'm essentially doing is using the confirmation bias to my advantage.
Like,
right?
take the example of John F. Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
At first I wasn't sure where the stillness happened. Then you explain it, but I was just curious how you kind of...
So the argument... So let's say I'm writing a book about stillness, and then I've decided that from my reading that there's like different types of stillness. There's a mental stillness, there's kind of a spiritual, emotional stillness, and there's a physical component too. So now I've got a sense that's what I want to do, and then so a lot of this is sort of gut and intuition, which is why you need all that practice, and you kind of have to have a sense. Like I think Plato talks about this. He's like, how can you find what you were looking for if you didn't already know what it is? Like there's this weird sort of philosophical paradox that we must already know everything, or how could we recognize it when we find it, right? So there's like this sense you kind of generally know, and so I'm sitting down, I'm going, okay, I want to illustrate what mental stillness looks like, and I kind of just flip through in my mind, like, what are examples that I'm vaguely familiar with that illustrate this, potentially, right? And so I thought, well, I kind of think about I was like, what are the stakes of the Cuban Missile Crisis? That must have been interesting. Maybe I was thinking about it because politically we're now like, I don't think that could ever happen again. And so I was like, well, maybe Kennedy, the idea is not like, I know Kennedy is the example. It's more like possibly he could be. So I start reading books about the missile crisis, and then my hypothesis has been somewhat confirmed, and then I go really deep in it until I find it, which is kind of what you learn as a research assistant. What Robert Greene would do is go like, I want to talk about this. I think there might be something here. Go tell me if there is or isn't. So I would have to go do the sort of unpleasant work of like sifting through something or going down a lot of dead ends. And so the Kennedy thing turned out to be right, but I could have found out, oh, actually, when you study the missile crisis, he proves the opposite of mental stillness, or it turns out it's too complicated or muddled, that doesn't work. So you're kind of just looking for it. And what the weirdest part, though, is you have this sort of general idea, and then you just tend to bump into things that end up working.
So along the way, until you got here, you sort of took a very alternative path. You
Sure.
Instead of finishing college, you were head of marketing at American Apparel. Then I think you worked with Tim Ferriss, you worked with Robert Greene, you worked with Tucker Max, you worked with all these different authors and thinkers. And was there ever a point where you sort of said to yourself, "Ugh, maybe I should have taken the quote unquote normal path"? Like at what point were you ever stressed enough that stoicism wasn't enough for you, or you didn't have enough where...
I don't think I was ever like the normal path, because I really don't like anyone telling me what to do. So I'm fundamentally like not cut out for like having a job. Like I don't like having to dress a certain way. I don't like having to show up a certain way. I don't like having to go to things that I don't like going to. So there's like a sort of, I'm not like a total contrarian, but I just don't like it when I don't get to decide how I'm going to do things. And so that, I think, ultimately sort of determined that at some point I was going to have to work for myself. So there was a time where I could be a research assistant for a while. There was a time when I could have a professional career. there was a time I could work with clients, but it was going towards a place where ultimately like I had to, like now sometimes like I'll go to DC, I'll have meetings and it's like, they'll have to wear a suit. And it's like my whole life is built around me not having to wear a suit. So it feels, it's like I'm like an outside dog or something. Like I'm not familiar with the way, and I really don't like whatever the constraints of being like an inside dog are.
So let's say you had to give 3 prescriptive ideas, maybe one physical, one mental, one spiritual, in terms of what's something people could just go and practice
to have more stillness in their life?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would say number 1 is some form of journaling. I think taking a quiet time to clear your mind, ideally at the beginning of the day, where you put your thoughts on paper and you're able to reflect on them from some semblance of a distance. All the time I feel like I write something in my journal, I'm like, do I really think that? Like, did that just come out? That's like awful. But it's the process of getting it out that allows me to process it and move past it.
And this is not journaling for the purpose of later publishing it. This is just
it's not a diary.
Spewing.
Yes, this is it's a process. Like if you think about what meditations is, Marcus Aurelius' work, he had no idea this would ever be published. And a lot of the ideas in it are not original. It's the process of writing them down and reflecting on them that's so valuable. So I think journaling would be one as the, so let's call that the mental practice. The spiritual practice, I would, what would be a good example there? I think some serious meditation on like why we're here, where we came from, what this all means. Because I do think if you think it's all meaningless, if you think this is all random chance, if you think you're in complete control, I think you will be rudely surprised.
But let's say you do think it's random chance.
Well, then I would think about what does that random chance actually mean? So like what the Stoics' version of a higher power is a sense of the logos, which is the idea that like the vast majority of what happens to us is outside of our control. And so our fundamental choice in terms of free will is like, are we going to get dragged unwillingly or are we going to happily go along? Like their analogy is like we're dogs tied to a cart. The cart's going where the cart's going to go. The dog can lay down and be dragged, or the dog can sort of cheerfully jot alongside, right? So I think just some serious spiritual work. Like when I don't think it's a coincidence. I think as part of my work in this book, I went from being an atheist to being agnostic, right? Which is actually a huge distinction. And an atheist says like, I know there's no God. Which I just, in retrospect, it's not a surprise to me that 19-year-old college Ryan was able to read 1 or 2 books and be like, I know that God does not exist, right? I think it's also ridiculous to be very certain that you know God exists. I think they're equally absurd positions. My point is like, I got to a place where I just don't know. And what I do know is that something is happening because there's some movement, like there seems to be something that could be this idea of the logos, it could be the universe, it could be random chance, it could be higher power, it could be any of these things, but like I'm going to have some humility in the face of this sort of great unknown, right?
Okay, and so that's a
spiritual.
mental practice was the journaling.
Yeah.
Spiritual practice is some reflection on, what do we do in a universe where almost everything is out of our control?
Yeah.
If we want not quite happiness, but well-being, would you say there's a distinction between happiness and well-being?
Yeah, and there's certainly a distinction between like success and sort of spiritual purpose and clarity, right? So there's lots of people who have lots of money but are utterly miserable because they don't have any idea. They think that the money or the fame is the happiness will ensue from there. But like I gotta think that I almost envy the sort of quiet, humble happiness of religious people, and I wonder why. Naval talks about it as like if you're successful but you're not happy, how smart are you? Do you know what I mean? So some work on sort of spiritual health, I think, would be one. And then the final one, though, I think, how does this manifest itself in practice? So I think, I guess I talked about this a little bit earlier, but like I go for a long walk every day, but it doesn't count as exercise. So I don't think about it for its physical benefits, even though it's a physical act. It's the clarity that comes from the movement that's very valuable. So I go for some long walk, and this is where I think, this is where a lot of my ideas happen. This is where I sort of try to practice gratitude. I think some active movement throughout the day is very important. And ideally, this is done outside, not on a treadmill in your office. Do you know what I mean? Like and it's not in a parking lot around your office building, right? This is like in the woods or on a nature trail. This is some sort of experience or exposure to something bigger than oneself.
So last question from me, and then we'll have some Q&A. When you're in a plane and it's packed, do you recline your seat all the way?
I would never recline my seat on an airplane because I'm not a fucking monster. People always go like, but if it wasn't okay to recline, why would they have the button? I mean, you can do anything you want. Just because it's allowed doesn't mean it's okay, right? Like one of you could put your feet up on this table right now. That's not like explicitly forbidden, but it would be a horrible, rude thing to do. And so what I always think about are like, what's the externality of my action? So like, and they go, but if I recline my seat, they can just recline their seat. And it's like, what a fucking awful logic for your actions, that because you did something rude to someone, it's okay because they can just pass this rudeness on to the person behind them. So I'm very staunchly anti-seat recline. I'm also anti. I'm anti a lot of things on planes. Like obviously, the person in the middle seat has access to both armrests, right? Things like this. I think very strongly about it.
You should write an entire, not a book,
yes.
but like it would be a good article, like a Stoic's thoughts on airplane etiquette.
Well, I think the problem with flying is that you just realize that like most human beings are like utterly selfish and like completely incapable of empathy and just like also generally like quite stupid. And it's sort of like the worst of humanity, all trapped in a thin metal tube with each other.
Q&A, and then don't forget, for every question you get, what are the names of the coins?
I think we have an Amor Fati coin and a Memento Mori coin.
And what do they mean?
So Memento Mori we talked about, it's a meditation on mortality, and then Amor Fati is this idea that at the end of the day, no amount of arguing is going to change the fact that people are going to recline their seats on airplanes. So you have to.
Well, so this is a great point.
Yes.
That in terms of opinions,
yes,
like it almost seems not really worthwhile. It's okay to have an opinion about what you would or wouldn't do in a situation, but it seems like not worthwhile to basically think strongly about any one opinion to the point where you have to argue it.
Yeah, of course. Like I'm never going to confront another person about them reclining their chair because that's like their decision. But I'm going to
be going up and down the plane, loser.
Right. Because at the core of it, because of my opinion, it's going to determine the one thing I do control, which is like what action I'm going to take. So they're going to recline their seat on me. I'm not going to let it get to me, and then I'm not going to pass. I'm just not going to continue the problem.
And I feel also that that's a good way to practice.
Of course. I think this is a metaphor for life. Like people are going to do awful things is not an excuse for you to be awful. And in fact, all you can do is just be the opposite of what you think is awful.
So questions, and Ryan will have answers. Oh, and we'll repeat any question you say.
Yeah.
Ryan, what's the biggest change in your life that you've made based on what you've learned researching this trilogy?
Yeah, that's a good question. So he's asking what changes I've made in my own life as a result of the research that I've done. I would say journaling is a big one. I always sort of thought journaling be nice, it would be cool. I sort of admired people that did it. And then really realizing that as far as practicing the philosophy goes, there's really no Stoicism and journaling are the same thing. All the Stoic texts we have are this process of meditating on the same ideas from different angles over and over again. So I think that's a big one. The Memento Mori practice would probably be the second one. This idea of like I think most people instinctively, reflexively do not want to think about the fact that they're going to die. It's scary, and it threatens. It's like in the legal system, you're like jury nullification, if you know what that is like the thing no one can talk about because the whole system collapses if you can just like convince a jury that the underlying law is not important or somehow unethical. Like the system has to like take things for granted. It's almost as if as a human species, like if we think about the fact that we're going to die, it kind of feels like it renders everything meaningless. I actually think it's the opposite, that death is what gives all of this some end point. It's what creates prioritization. It's what creates purpose. And so it's something I try to actively think about and never, as Shakespeare said, every third thought shall be of my grave. I don't know if it has to be that common, but I do think no day should go by without you going like, today was it. Would I be good? Or am I leaving something on the table?
I'm just curious, just to add to that question, I find if you think about death in the ways you've always thought about your whole life, sometimes what I mean is if you say, okay, I'm going to die probably within the next 30 years, that feels like a really long time. But if I try to look at it in an unusual measurement, like, oh, I'm going to see my kids only 6 more times before I die, because now they have their own families, and I'll see their own Christmas. Or if I say, I've only got 30 more summers instead of 30 more years. And why do you think that happens? That if you look at it in an unusual way, it feels more real?
It's because we get used to it. Sort of it sinks into the background, and because it's so uncomfortable, because it so requires us to change, we try to think about it always the same way so we don't have to. I think the most powerful way comes from Seneca. He goes like, we think that we are moving forward towards death, that death is in the future. And he says, no, death is happening. All the seconds that are ticking by right now or that have already happened, he's like, that time belongs to death. So instead of thinking that I'm gonna live to 70, so I have 40 years left, I think 30 years of my life are already dead. And so that actually death is this thing that's happening right now as I'm talking. Seneca says we are dying every day, not that we die in the future. It, to me, is like sort of a wake-up call way to think about it.
And a great way to encourage everybody to order another round of drinks from the bar.
Yes, of course.
You had a question.
Yeah, so I have 2 main questions.
Okay.
One is to continue on your research process. How much did you end up, would you likely to end up changing or reshaping your argument based on your research, or do you have like a pretty much done deal argument, and how does that like interact?
And what's the second one?
The second one is how do you think about following your own fascination when you're writing these books versus like thinking about what's relevant for the audience?
All right. So her question is how much does where the facts go sort of in the research shaping what you're saying, or how much is it you sort of already have the sense? And then she's asking sort of my personal fascination, how that affects things. I think you start with a hypothesis, but it can't. There's this idea. I think it's from who's the Freakonomics economist?
Stephen Levitt.
He's saying strong opinions weakly held. So you have some sense, but you have to be willing to discard and change that based on information. Like a scientist has a hypothesis, and then they seek both confirmation and disconfirmation in the hypothesis. So that's what I'm doing when I think I know, but I'm willing to let what I find shape it and control it. But ultimately, I'm writing about what I think is interesting. So the personal like you can write about anything. I only want to write about what I'm struggling with or am interested in or I think is important to right now. So that's ultimately the filter of what you include or don't include.
Who had the question back there?
She's paying her bill.
Oh, okay. Sir?
Yeah, what's your question?
No. First, I'd like to say I was a flight attendant for 5 years, so I understand.
She was a flight attendant for 5 years? Is Ryan dead on?
But also I appreciate, but the thing thing is, I am Republican. I don't appreciate you bashing the president. It hurts our feelings. It really does.
Why would that possibly offend you?
Like, you're saying something bad against our president? He's running our country.
Yeah. I also think he's a fucking moron, and it's totally my right to call him a fucking moron. And if you called someone I like a fucking moron, do you know what that would mean to me? It would mean nothing, because it's your opinion.
I didn't call you anything. And first of all, you're using your book platform to bash the president, and that's not fair.
Okay, first off, it's totally fair. He's not. If I wanted to, I would.
Yes, anybody around here.
Ask them what? Ask them what?
If it's fair that you're using your book platform.
That I'm using my book to say my opinion? That's like literally the definition of fair. And that me, a tiny regular person, would write about literally the most powerful man in the world? How is that unfair? How is it unfair for a private citizen to express their opinion about the person who literally commands the largest army in the fucking world? That's like the definition of fair.
You're using your book platform for this.
For what? For my opinion?
Yes.
That's what my platform is for. That's why would I get this email all the time from people. They're like, how dare you say your opinion? It's my opinion on my platform. Why would I build an email list? Why would I write books if I'm not going to use it to say what I think?
Your book is about stillness.
My book is about whatever the fuck I want it to be. That's why my name is on the cover. Let's do another question.
I think though, the point is there's got to be ways for people to express their opinions, even if you disagree with them. So I think that's the definition, also of compromise and freedom of speech and a lot of things. I don't agree with everything Ryan says. I'll just say an example. I've had the same business partner since 1999. I'm pro-choice. He's pro-life. He's super pro-gun. He's super religious. None of these things. And we've never once had an argument, even though we've talked about all of these issues. So I think it's healthy to have discussions about these things and be able to freely express your opinion without worrying about it turning into a fight or a joke or whatever. That's why we have voices. So, all right. Yes.
So first of all, it's a great honor to be here. I'm all the way back from India. I've been following your works all my life. Obstacle is the way is my Bible.
Oh, that's awesome, man. Thanks.
Thank you. My question is, so Stoicism comes across as this middle ground, like between the extremes, between the ecstasy on one side and the negative emotions on the other side.
Sure.
So when you're going that upward spiral, like you're moving towards ecstasy, like do you keep it check? And so how do you make peace with that middle ground, sort of between the extremes? Like, is it bad to be too happy or too ecstatic? Like, does that translate into, you switching to the other side?
So he's sort of asking about, like, how do you find balance with these sort of extremes of either being too negative or too positive, too happy, too I like, Aristotle has this idea of the golden mean, and he says that every virtue lies in the midpoint between two vices. The Stoics didn't totally agree, but I think it's a great concept. So courage being a virtue to the Stoics, Aristotle would go like, okay, so on the one side, there's cowardice. That's an absence of courage. And then on the other hand, there'd sort of be rashness or foolhardiness. This would be an excess of courage, right? And so courage is the right amount. Like true courage is not having absolutely no regard for your own safety, and it's not such an obsession with your own safety that you're unable to risk things. So the idea of balance or this middle ground is, I think, a really important way to think about it. So I don't think that, for me, when I think of the Stoic, I don't think of someone who has no emotions. I think of someone who has an even keel, sort of in any and all situations.
So to extend this question, though, and I'm sorry if I interrupted, but it seems like that's what makes Stoicism quite rightly difficult to practice.
Of course.
Because like you mentioned before...
Well, if it was easy, what value would there be in it, right?
So like you mentioned before with Buddhism, it's one thing to just renounce your entire life and live in a cave. Yeah. It's sort of like that's almost this safe way to provide you this solution to take an extreme. if you look at Greek philosophy, if you want to think of like Stoicism on steroids, is like cynicism, where they essentially do take the nihilist view.
It's
that
a rejection
nothing
of
matters.
everything. Yes.
Right. And so how do they, like cynicism, I would say, was more like Taoism even than
A little
Stoicism.
bit. It's incompatible with like a normal life, right? The like Diogenes, the famous cynic philosopher, he like lives in a barrel, he masturbates in public, he like is off the grid essentially.
Hashtag me too all the time.
So I don't think that works. Like I think you want to think about how does this scale? What if everyone was like that? It would not be well. So I think what the Stoic it is a little bit about the middle ground. That I think the Stoic is thinking like, yeah, what would happen if everyone did this, and trying to find a balance there.
Yeah, and so in other words, that's part of the practice is finding.
Yeah,
I really like what you said before about find what you have control over, find what you love.
Yeah.
Find out, and that takes trial and error, but then find out what you have control over, find out what you don't, and focus on the love part and the part that you can control.
Yeah.
And somehow that's going to find your Stoic middle ground, to answer your question.
And the Stoics actually have an interesting middle ground towards, because some of the early sort of more cynical Stoics are like, money doesn't matter, fame doesn't matter, power doesn't matter, we should sort of renounce all these things. And what Seneca sort of helps crystallize, he says, actually, there's good things and there's bad things, right? Like bad things is like being a liar, bad things is being unethical, bad things, whatever. And then good things are the virtues. And he said, but then in the middle, he calls them like preferred indifference. So he's like, money is a preferred indifferent. Like, obviously, not having money doesn't mean you can't have a good life. Having money doesn't mean you automatically have a good life. But if you think about it, you'd probably rather have money than not have money. He's like, it's better to be tall than short, right? It's better to be rich than poor. That doesn't mean it's inherently a good. He just calls it a preferred indifferent, which to me is like a way to split the difference. Like you would rather have it if you have a choice, but when you don't have a choice, you don't let it affect you.
Which is why I think it's important to practice in advance.
Yeah.
Like most of the time, you don't really need to know where the gray area is. But to practice in advance the things you were describing, the other things you describe in this book. For instance, to write this book, you had to negotiate the deal for this book.
Sure.
So you not only want to be
It'd be
a great
better
writer.
to have more control over it than less control. But if the situation was whatever it was, you would make the most of it, right? And that's sort of the idea. So the Stoic is like, I want it, ideally it's this way, but I'll make do whatever way it happens to be. And so that to me is a position of flexibility and adaptability that you need.
And I think that's a critical difference between what you're saying, which feels very spiritual, very even like Eastern philosophy, but at the same time, there's this very practical aspect, which is you're not saying the world is an illusion, everything's meaningless.
Yeah.
You're saying
there is no self. Yeah.
Right. You're saying kind of, we don't know, and that's fine, but here's what I do know. I love writing. I want the best possible reach for my book. I want to be able to do this. So I can't control if I'm going to be on Oprah, but I can control or
Sure.
try to control the negotiation, and I can certainly control the material in the book.
That's right.
So two things. So Ryan's going to do a book signing for a half hour, and then everybody who has a ticket to this automatically has a ticket to the 9 p.m. comedy show here, which you're all welcome to come to.
Are you going to perform?
I am going to perform.
There you go.
But now I'm going to have to make up a whole bunch of jokes about airplanes and stoicism, so I don't know what I'm going to say yet. But you're all welcome to stay for that, and thanks very much for coming to this podcast. Give it up for Ryan.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.